Thank you so much, Councilwoman Rose. Good morning, everybody. You know something? I know it's early and it's cold, but good morning, everybody. Good morning. We're waking up. There we go. You know, first, let me say what a pleasure and an honor it is to be here this morning. I'm going to say something first about my friend, Debbie Rose. And I'm going to just lead with the word councilwoman, councilperson. It's been a little more than a year since she was sworn in. It still is something good to say. You know, Debbie didn't have things handed to her. She had to turn around. She ran in 2001, and she ran a strong campaign back then. And there were a lot of people who thought that she should have been in the city council back then. Well, she turned around and ran again. And back then again, there were a lot of people who said, she's not going to win. And you knew you heard it.
Yes, sir.
She can't win. Well, election night, she won. And I have to tell you, Staten Island and New York City is lucky to have her in the city council. It is great. Absolutely. It is something that I look at every time I see her on TV or in person before an audience. I just smile. We talk about, and February is Black History Month. We talk about African American history being made on a daily basis. She is a slice of history. First person from Staten Island. She continues to make history each and every day. So it is definitely, as I said, it is an honor. And let me talk, when you talk about coming back from losing an election, she serves as inspiration to me. So let me tell you, Debbie, it is good seeing you. It is always a pleasure. And it's an honor to be here this morning. Oh, you don't have to worry about that. and I'm not going to get into you've introduced a number of people, and there are people on panels later. Reverend Brown, it's always good to see you. And one last person who I have to mention, and my apologies, and I'm sorry to do that, but when you know somebody, I know Richard Green is on a panel later. Richard and I have known each other since, I'd almost say since Richard didn't have dreads and I had a big afro. It's been a long, and when the lights come on, you see Richard, you'll understand what I'm talking about. And neither one of us had gray hair. He and I have known each other probably since 1974 or 75. And he has always been there for our children. And it is good to see him this morning. You know, I'm going to try, and the one thing about being a keynote, it usually kind of, people sit there and go, oh Lord, he's going to speak forever. And I always try and make a few points and move on. As we celebrate, and the one thing, and it's good that first, that there's so many people here on such a cold morning. It's why we're here. Dr. King, and we're celebrating his life, and this event for him isn't on the holiday, isn't on his birthday. And that's good because it shouldn't just be limited to that. As we look at the lessons that he taught us, as we look at what he stood for, it shouldn't be on those 2 days. It should be each and every day because it still has relevance today. The fight that he led for civil rights in the 1950s and 60s is still so relevant today. You know, one of the things and that I believe is important as we look at Dr. King, as we look at what he stood for and what he fought for, we need not just to look at where we're at today. We need to look forward, but also we need to look back. We need to take a look back and understand the times that he lived in. And one of the things that, you know, and I guess I talked about how long Richard and I have known each other, and I guess, you know, as the years go by and you see so many things change, you still want to take a step back to understand where we've come from. I'm 57 years old, and you know, a lot of people say, that's not that old. And I'm sure a lot of younger people would say, damn, that's old. But when you go back and look, I grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in central Brooklyn, in Bedford-Stuyvesant. I was fortunate. My father, and I'm going to talk about him a little bit. My dad is 86 years old now. He is working still 5 days a week. I spoke to him in the office yesterday. I'll see him at dinner later tonight. He's bringing a date, which is, you know, No, let me tell you, he's 86 years old. He is dating still. It's just amazing. You know, I just sit there and go, please let it be genetic. Please let it be genetic. But he hit mandatory retirement age as a judge of the appellate division over 10 years ago. They have, you know, a mandatory retirement age at 76. He's still working as an attorney. He's still going strong. He's still is quicker than I am. And I have to admit, it's still like, wow. He's 30 years older than I am just about and still going strong. But back in the late 1950s and 1960s in Brooklyn and really in New York, he was the regional head of the NAACP. Now, we can talk about, he has a little bit in common, not a little, a lot in common with Debbie. When you talk about people being first, he was the first African-American state senator in Brooklyn's history, back in 1965. But the regional head of the NAACP, there were things that he was involved in back then that I think had, you know, that you look back on, I still remember. And the first thing, just to make the tie-in quickly with Dr. King talked about, and so many think that he was only speaking about segregation and Jim Crow in the South. Well, to be able to understand segregation, discrimination, to be able to understand what Dr. King fought about, I always look at it not at what happened in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi, because that was more legal forms of segregation, Jim Crow and the Jim Crow laws. I look at New York City. I look at what I understood and what was closest to me. I look at Brooklyn and look at some of the things that were occurring in Brooklyn and New York City in the late 50s and 1960s, all the way through the late 60s into the 70s. I look at, and first let me take one quote from Dr. King. If you go back and look at some of his speeches, the speech and his I Have a Dream speech in Washington, which I believe was about August of that year. There were other speeches that led up to it. When the I Have a Dream speech wasn't first unveiled there in some ways, it was changed a bit, but it was spoken about in a number of other places. A speech that he gave at the Great March on Detroit in June of 1963. And let me read you one line from it. And this is obviously a group of people who had helped to contribute that he was speaking to. And he talked about, now the second thing that you can do to help us down in Alabama and Mississippi and all over the South is to work with determination to get rid of any segregation and discrimination in Detroit, realizing that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And we've got to see the problem of racial injustice is a national problem. No community in this country can boast of clean hands in the area of brotherhood now, in the area of brotherhood. Now in the North, it's different, in that it doesn't have the legal sanction that it has in the South. But it has its subtle and hidden forms, and it exists in three areas. In the area of employment discrimination, in the area of housing discrimination, and in the area of de facto segregation in the public schools. And we must come to see that de facto segregation in the North is just as injurious as the actual segregation in the South. And so if you want to help us in Alabama and Mississippi and over the South, do all that you can to get rid of the problem here. That was Dr. King talking about not about segregation in the South, but in the North. Now, as I said, my point of reference, and a lot of it was seeing, in fact, what my father did as the regional head of the NAACP in the 50s and 60s. I remember, and Reverend Brown can appreciate this, I remember my father going to bail out, as the head of the NAACP, a number of the ministers, Reverend Dr. Gardner Taylor, for those of you who know names, Reverend William Augustus Jones, Reverend Milton Galamison, and many others. They had done things like picket down at the A&P supermarket, at that point on Utica Avenue, where black people could shop, but they couldn't get a job. I remember them sitting down in the middle of Bedford-Stuyvesant in front of the bulldozers over on Fulton Street, as a new boys and girls high school was being built. It still stands there today. Place was being built for African American children, but nobody who was African American could get a job there. And they sat down in front of the bulldozers until a few people were hired. Electricians and carpenters, skilled places, or skilled jobs. But if they hadn't stood up and fought, no one would have been employed there. That was the New York City, the Brooklyn of the, not just the 1950s, the 1960s, the early 1970s, where people stood up to fight for equality. So we see so much. As a matter of fact, one of the people, and we still talk about it today, there was a young man, a young boy preacher who got arrested back then a few times with the ministers, and there was a little debate about the ministers. He was about 14 back in the 1970s, a young Reverend Al Sharpton, who was arrested then. He and my father still talk about him bailing him out when he was about 14 years old. But we have to look back first to understand where we're at and how far we've come and what has to be done. We have to look back and understand where we came from. One of the things that I try and talk about, not just during Martin Luther King's holiday and during that period of time, African American History Month and other things, is letting our children understand the history that they've, and not just black children, all children. Letting them understand the history of this country and this city, because then they have a greater appreciation for where we're at today and a better understanding of what it will take to get to places tomorrow. And too many children, all they understand are the images that they see on television these days, or the internet and others. And if they don't dig down, if those who remember don't talk to them, don't let them understand, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. We always talk about it. People who don't remember the past are doomed to repeat it. We don't want to see that. But we also want young people to understand that things that have been given to them today were earned by what so many others did in the past. By not just the deaths, but the sacrifices that were made by so many in the past. By the dreams that many had lived or had in the past that were never able to be realized because the opportunity wasn't there for them. We need to let them understand. Our children today understand where we're at. Now, since the 1950s and 60s, since Dr. King marched, we've seen so much change. We have seen, more laws, Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act. We've seen change. We've seen corporate presidents who are now African American. We've seen so much change. Places that you couldn't go before, that you can go now. Back in the 60s, the fight over segregation in the 60s was about accommodations. We'll be able to walk in a restaurant and sit down and eat. It's about being able to stay in any hotel that you wanted. I talked to my father. It was funny, during Barack Obama's run for president, my father talked about coming back after World War II. He'd been a veteran, was in the Army, served overseas, had been wounded. He remembers coming back through the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., not being able to eat in the mess hall, in the dining hall that the white soldiers were able to eat in. And what made it worse, because Washington, D.C. believed in Jim Crow also, believed in segregation. The prisoners of war, the German prisoners of war, were able to eat in that dining hall where black soldiers who had fought for their country weren't able to eat. No, so many things have changed over the years. So many things are different from where we're at. So many things have changed. And no, did I ever think that I would ever see in my lifetime an African-American president? Nope, I never did. I knew my father never did. I was surprised to hear that my daughter, who's 31, we did a TV show together, right about the inauguration time. My daughter said on camera, she never thought that she'd see it. I said, she's 31, she's a public school teacher. She didn't think she'd see an African-American president. So many things have changed. So many things are different than they were at the same point. And after Barack Obama's election, there was a lot that was talked about a post-racial era. We all saw that. Post-racial era. Race didn't matter any longer. Everything was good. Well, Dr. King's dream had been realized. Well, maybe not quite. Maybe not yet. I think that what we are looking at these days isn't the battle as he had to fight it, to change the law, to be able to go into a restaurant or be able to get a room in any hotel, to not have segregation or at least legal segregation. But I also think that, you know, as Dr. King, and as he talked about economics and economic equality, if you don't have the money to rent that hotel room, well, it doesn't matter that you can go there. If you don't have the money to be able to sit down at the restaurant counter and be able to order a meal and pay for it, it almost doesn't matter that you can get into that restaurant now. Dr. King had talked about economic equality. As we look at the challenges that face us in the future, that is one of the huge things that we have to deal with. We look at an earnings gap still in this country, in this state, in this city. As we just went through a recession, and the issue that we looked at and heard about, that too many people experienced, that we know, and maybe even some of us in this room, the issue of foreclosure. Well, it wasn't just, I mean, it wasn't limited to any one group. But if you look at New York City, it disproportionately fell. The issues of foreclosure, the areas that had the highest rate of foreclosures, Central Brooklyn, Southeast Queens, parts of the Bronx. No, the foreclosures hit everybody. And I did a number of, workshops to help keep people, when I was comptroller, in their homes, in Staten Island, all across the city of New York. And the faces were different in each and every community. But if you look at the numbers and who were disproportionately hit in the city of New York, where people were African American and Hispanic. We still look at economic inequalities. And as we look at the unemployment rate, and at the height of the recession in New York City, the unemployment rate was close to 10%, but for African American and African American men, it was about 18 or 19% on the record. 18 and 19% that have been announced, which that means it's usually a lot higher than that. Some would say double. Some would say double. And David Jones, I know he had to have left, because David wanted to be here, but then as his wife said, make sure you're at a certain point today, at a certain time to meet me. David, who at the head of the Community Service Society, has done a lot of reports that have looked at the gap, particularly in those who are between the age of 16 and 24, who are African American, who are unemployed, and he's talked about the rate being there, 75%, which is a frightening number. So when we look at Dr. King's dream, has it been realized yet? When we look at economic inequality or the need for economic equality, no, we still have a ways to go. And as we also look at the education gap, and I know it's going to be spoken about later, the graduation rate and the gap there, the performance gap between students of color and their other counterparts, disparities in education and educational limit or level based on race. That happens to be part of Dr. King's dream. Children receiving equal education. We still have work to do. We still have a ways to go. We still haven't realized Dr. King's dream. So Dr. King's dream just wasn't about ending Jim Crow law. Just wasn't about making sure that you had the legal protections. As he talked about a country that was equal, it wasn't just with civil rights laws. It was in education. It was in economics. And never forget, he was in Memphis where he died. He was there to stand up for economic justice. A strike of garbage men. And he was there to stand with them because he believed in economic equality. So we still have a ways to go before we fully realize Dr. King's dream. Let me just close with one more quote from Dr. King's dream that starts to let you understand that what his dream fully encompassed. And as I said, if you go back, he had started the I Have a Dream speech before he was in Washington. And one of the lines is, I have a dream this afternoon that one day right here in Detroit, Negroes will be able to buy a house or rent a house anywhere that their money will carry them, and they'll be able to get a job. So we see, as I said, so much. It wasn't just civil rights. It was an economic equality and education equality. So let's use this Martin Luther King birthday and celebration today. Let's use it to be able to fuel ourselves, to understand that, yes, we have come so far, so far, further than I think Dr. King might have been able to believe back then. But in understanding how far we have come, let's look to the future and understand how far we still have to go.